Today I'm going to continue taking you through An Inspector Calls, and we're going to look at Act 2. So if you missed my video on context and Act 1, please go back, check that out before you watch this video so that you're up to date with everything you need to know. Act 2 is where the play really starts to get interesting. We already know that there's a girl called Eva Smith who killed herself by drinking disinfectant. Mr. Birling then shares the fact that he fired her because she asked for a little more pay. Sheila, his daughter, then confesses that she complained about Eva and got her fired from Millward's because she was jealous of the way Eva looked. And in Act 2, we now see the further interrogations of Gerald Croft, who's the future son-in-law of the Birlings, and Mrs. Birling. Now, Gerald Croft reveals more about his character by trying to get Sheila, his fiancée, to leave the room. He speaks on her behalf and he says, "She's had a long, exciting and tiring day," with this triplet of adjectives elongating how fatigued Sheila must be as a woman coping with so much drama. But the audience is aware that he actually wants her out of the way so that he can confess to his affair with Eva Smith, or Daisy Renton, because she has a new name. So after Eva got fired from her second job because of Sheila, she ended up in even more poverty. And she changed her name to Daisy, and she was left with very little choice but to go to the Palace Theatre, a favourite place of the women of the town. So basically she's forced into prostitution to make ends meet. But again, like in Act 1, we learned that she was different to typical poor women found there. She was very pretty, soft brown hair and big dark eyes. Breaks off, "My God." That's what Gerald says. And Gerald's fragmented speech and his description of Daisy's appearance does connote some sort of emotional connection he had with her, not just a physical one. Priestley makes sure that we understand that Gerald does have human compassion and is able to feel grief, or at least loss, unlike the older Birlings. He reveals that he got her a place to stay, and he says, "I want you to understand that I didn't install her there so that I could make love to her." The audience does actually believe him, as does Sheila, as does the inspector, despite his objectification of women in the verb choice install. You don't install a woman, so that's quite interesting. Sheila is able to somewhat empathize how this happened. She says, "You were the wonderful fairy prince. You must have adored it, Gerald." Because Gerald, like most of the rich men during that time, wouldn't have thought it was that deep that he was keeping a mistress, because they all kind of did it. But when Gerald eventually breaks up with Daisy, it's interesting that she doesn't react in a stereotypically working class way. She doesn't blackmail him or try and exploit the situation, "Give me money or I'll tell your fiancé." In fact, he says she was very gallant about it. This isn't language we would associate with pretty poor girls at the time. Gallant is an adjective you would use for brave, medieval, heroic knights. Gallant. And again, the audience gain a picture of the huge potential Daisy had, a strong moral compass and a courage to fight for a better life. Sheila really shines in this act. We can see the maturity in her character through the maturity of her language. She now uses lots of metaphors and almost becomes the voice of the inspector, challenging her own family even more than he does. She tells her mum, "You mustn't try to build up a kind of wall between us and that girl. If you do, then the inspector will just break it down." And she's right. Perceptive, intelligent, and accurate, despite her mother's continuous patronizing attitude towards her, as well as the younger generation in general. Yet most significantly, Sheila shows her metamorphosis, her transformation, when she says, "But just in case you forget or decide not to come back, Gerald, I think you better take this with you." And she hands him the ring. I am so proud of her in this bit. Do you remember how excited Sheila was about that ring? Oh, mummy, isn't it a beauty? I feel engaged. But here, Priestley uses stage directions to juxtapose her earlier excitement. Sheila's rejection of that ring symbolically displays her growth and understanding as a character, as well as her dismissal of capitalism. When she hands back that ring to Gerald, she is actually alleviating herself of the capitalist values she was brought up with. She's rejecting capitalism, giving it back. She isn't dependent on her parents anymore the way she used to be. She's making decisions for herself. Now, the way Sheila gains a voice and gains power as the play progresses mirrors the feminist movement. Sheila's transformation seems to mirror the rise of the suffrage movement. The Edwardian audience was experiencing some radical changes in women demanding and gaining more rights. So Sheila as a character is a microcosm. She is a small symbol for the beginning of feminism. Priestley uses her character as a vehicle to convey the message to the audience that just like Sheila, they should gain a voice too. Listen, all the women in the audience, all the young women, you can fix the errors that men have made. Now let's look at the inspector. The inspector speaks more in this act than he did in Act 1. He is the only person who is able to understand why Sheila doesn't want to leave the room when everyone keeps cutting her off, as exemplified through the use of dashes, often at the end of her dialogue. And they're always trying to kick her out of the room, but the inspector says, and if she leaves us now and doesn't hear anymore, then she'll feel she's entirely to blame. She'll be alone with her responsibility the rest of tonight, all tomorrow. The asyndetic list demonstrates all the things going on in Sheila's mind. And in this way, the inspector is able to empathize with women as effectively as he empathizes with the working class. Therefore, he is a champion for all the voiceless minority groups, not just the poor. Priestley uses the inspector as a mouthpiece to convey the incredibly important socialist message that public men, Mr. Birling, have responsibilities as well as privileges, with that plosive alliteration in that quotation demonstrating his disapproving tone for the rich. Another important function of the inspector is to convey the message that the rich don't just have the monopoly on morality. What I mean by that is that just because you're rich doesn't mean you're a better person and more respectable. And it doesn't mean all people who are poor are criminals. That's a myth. It's a lie. And Old Joe Meggarty is a minor character, but he's hugely important because he's a symbol for this. Gerald describes the night he met Eva, or Daisy. He says a half-drunk and goggle-eyed man called Meggarty had wedged her into a corner with that obscene fat carcass of his. Now, the obscene and vulgar language here shows that Meggarty is basically forcing himself, when he's drunk, onto Daisy at the Palace Spa. And this is where Gerald saves her. And Mrs. Birling is genuinely staggered to hear this. She says, well, really? Alderman Meggarty, I must say, we are learning something tonight. In her narrow-minded, ignorant head, she has never processed the fact that an alderman could also be a rapist. She's also staggered to learn that her son is an alcoholic, which Sheila reveals to her. The family are learning truths, important ones, which should have been obvious, really, but it all served to show how capitalism blinds rich people from seeing the truth. Mrs. Birling's interrogation is the most dramatic and fiery of the whole play, I think. She continues patronizing her own daughter as well as the inspector. She says, you seem to have made a great impression on this child, Inspector. Belittling Sheila's opinions and experience by talking about her in third person. However, the inspector is not fazed. He says, we often do on the young ones, they're more impressionable, emphasizing the message that it's the future generation who can make a change and will not repeat the same mistakes of their parents of the past. Mrs. Birling also continues to stereotype and reveal her contempt for the working class, shown through her attitude towards Eva Smith. She says, girls of that class, she says snidely, and oh, as if a girl of that sort would ever refuse money. Mrs. Birling cannot comprehend that a working class individual would ever reject money. Of course, all poor people must be obsessed with money. Therefore, when Eva comes to the charity that Mrs. Birling is a prominent member of to ask for help when she's pregnant, Mrs. Birling abuses her position and authority and admits that she refused to give her the help and support that she needed. In the Edwardian era, there was no welfare state, there were no benefits. Eva was completely reliant on these charity organizations for help. But unfortunately, she found herself face to face with arguably the most uncharitable and therefore the most ironically placed woman in a charity organization. She's in that position to show off to people that she's so helpful and great, but she's a hypocrite. Mrs. Birling's chilling and callous character and her absolute lack of remorse or responsibility is the most shocking part. She justifies her actions and says, I'm sorry she should have come to such a horrible end, but I accept no blame for it at all. The conjunction but completely dismisses the first half of this quote. It's basically a sorry, not sorry. Mrs. Birling thinks she's smart, very smart, and this hubris, this pride is what eventually takes her down. Because she tries to shift her actions onto the hypothetical boy who impregnated Eva. She thinks she's being really clever. She says, if you take some steps to find this young man and then make sure that he's compelled to confess in public his responsibility. The conditional clause here shows that she's doing the inspector's job for him. The alliteration of the hard C sound, that guttural alliteration, demonstrates how excited she is that she's saving her whole family from this annoying situation that has just unexpectedly arisen. His responsibility, not mine, not ours, someone else's. She doesn't care about whose future she's destroying as long as she's saving hers. Priestley beautifully shows the selfishness of capitalism as this young idler turns out to be her own son, Eric. Eric got drunk and raped Eva and got her pregnant. And she, Mrs. Birling, has caused her own son's downfall by putting all the blame on him. The inspector despises Mrs. Birling and reveals a far more assertive and explosive side to his character. He challenges her very directly. He said, you've had children. You must have known what she was feeling. And you slammed the door in her face. And that repetition, you, the direct address, it's accusatory and it forces her to reflect on the part she has played in this mess. He compels her to think about her maternal role, her role as a mother, and her absolute lack of compassion that she still maintains. She's harsh, she's abrasive, and she's cold. And the inspector has had enough of her and her husband. When Mr. Birling tries to stand up for his wife, the inspector says, don't stammer and yammer at me again, man. I've lost all patience with you people. These people don't deserve the inspectors or our respect. The play has reached its climactic point now, the maximum point of tension, preparing us for the Act 3 resolution. I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you are desperate to know what happens next. If you are, go and watch the next video. Give this one a like and don't forget to check out the rest of the videos in this series.